Good evening. I'm Patrick Lewis, the Director of Collections and Research at the Filson Historical Society. I'm so glad you joined us for tonight's presentation, The Fall of Kentucky's Rock, Western Kentucky Democratic Politics Since the New Deal. George G. Humphreys was Research Director for the Oklahoma House of Representatives and later the Extended Campus Director for the Madisonville Community College. He's the author of Taylorism in France, 1904 to 1920, The Impact of Scientific Management on Factory Relations and Society, and Oklahoma Politics and Policies, Governing the Sooner State. I'll return to moderate questions after the presentation as time permits. Please join me in welcoming George Humphreys.
Thank you, Patrick, for the kind introduction. Off air, we were talking briefly about a special connection between Muhlenberg County and the Filson Society. Otto Rothert, who was the secretary for the Filson Society for more than a quarter century, was a frequent visitor to Muhlenberg County, where I have lived the last 20 years. His family owned property in Muhlenberg County, and he came this way to hunt frequently. His passion for Muhlenberg County grew, and in 1913, he wrote a history of Muhlenberg County, which still stands out among the numbers of county histories in Kentucky. After retiring in 1945, his love for Muhlenberg County continued, and he moved to Greenville, where he spent the last days of his life. Just by way of a little bit more introduction and how I got into writing this book, after finishing my bachelor's and master's degree at Murray State University in the early 70s, moved to Oklahoma, where I finished my doctorate. And as Patrick mentioned, I worked for about 25 years as a staff director for the Oklahoma House of Representatives. There I was involved in several writing projects using my experience and knowledge of Oklahoma history and politics. I wrote several pieces there, but by the year 2000, my wife and I had decided that we would, after finishing my career with the Oklahoma legislature, would want to move back to Muhlenberg County, back to Western Kentucky. In 2004, I was offered the position of Extended Campus Director at Madisonville Community College, and we moved to Muhlenberg County, into the home where my wife was born and raised. At the time I left, I still felt like I had at least one more book project left in me, and thought that I would like to do something in Kentucky history. I very early thought it curious that Western Kentucky produced so many governors in the 20th century, but very little had been written about Western Kentucky. And the project, it was on my mind. I did write a history of Madisonville Community College that took me away from the project. But by about 2010, I decided that nobody else was going to do this project, and that I would try. So in 2012, I went to the University Press of Kentucky, and they agreed to publish a book, and which I thought would be finished in 3 or 4 years, but it turned out to take a lot more time. In the intervening time, I lost a lot of momentum. The University Press of Kentucky lost its legislative appropriation, and I had real questions, real doubts about whether the University Press of Kentucky would survive, and I would have lost my publisher. Anyway, the higher education system in the state picked up the ball, helped with funding the University Press, and I went on to continue working on this project. By about 2017, my editor, Patrick O'Dowd, suggested that it was time to send my manuscript off to have it reviewed. And one of the comments that I received really stuck with me. I had my focus was always on politics, but I think the reader felt like I was spending too much time talking about matters that, in Washington or in Frankfurt, and that I needed to shift my focus more to Western Kentucky, back to the local events. And fortunately, in the intervening time, newspapers.com had emerged and put online, searchable online, newspapers that were so invaluable to me. I was able to search the Paducah, Owensboro, Bowling Green, Madisonville, and several other smaller papers. So I spent a great deal of time digging deeper into what was transpiring at the local level. Now, I guess we should probably just get a better idea of what I mean by Western Kentucky. And Scott, if you'll go ahead and put up that map so the viewers can see what I'm talking about. Okay. This is what I consider to be Western Kentucky. Basically, it's a line, and there's been any number of ways suggested of dividing up or defining Western Kentucky. But my Western Kentucky, I start from the eastern edge of Hancock, Ohio, Butler, Warren, and Simpson counties. And what's left are the 28 most western counties in Kentucky. Represents about 28% of the state's land mass, less than 20% of the population. Although it's, Western Kentucky is always considered fairly rural, but please keep in mind that also in Western Kentucky, you have 5 of the largest 20 largest cities in the state. Bowling Green is the 3rd largest, Owensboro's 4th. Then you have Paducah, Hopkinsville, and Henderson, all ranking in the top 20 counties. But in any case, there are those who disagree with me, and particularly people who see Warren County and probably Simpson County as not part of Western Kentucky. I got a great deal of pushback from several people that said, that I was just wrong. And of course, I did some research, and I finally said, well, until they take the name down from the university there in Bowling Green and call it something else other than Western Kentucky University, Warren County was going to be part of Western Kentucky. Other people go even further. In the legislature, the Western Kentucky Legislative Caucus takes in all of Kentucky west of I-65. I don't agree with that. I don't see much in the way of affinity between Elizabethtown on the east and Paducah on the west. I might have to reconsider after the legislature this session extended the 1st congressional district, always the most western of the state's congressional district, all the way from Fulton County into Franklin County. That's, of course, Frankfurt. But in any case, this is my Western Kentucky. Now, as far as the Rock of Gibraltar, or the idea of Western Kentucky as the state's democratic rock, Scott, if you'll give me the next slide. Here's a chart that helps explain why this is the case. If you look at the governor's races from 1927 through 59, it's on this chart, represented on this chart, you can see that in the second column, if a Democrat didn't receive between at least 30,000 or more pluralities from Western Kentucky, the chances of that Democrat winning was fairly small. Such is the case in 1927, when the Democratic candidate received less than 27,000 votes, and Flem Sampson, the Republican, won. Another case to that point is 1943. The Democrat only won by 20,000 votes in Western Kentucky and lost it to Simeon Willis in that particular election. One of the mistakes of that particular cycle was that there was nobody from Western Kentucky on the general election slate. Now, if we will go on, Scott, to the next slide. During the period that I covered, basically it's 1931, pretty much up to 1994, there were 7 Democratic governors from Western Kentucky elected during that time frame. 2 of them are in this particular slide. To the center left is Ruby LaFoon from Madisonville. He was elected governor in 1931. To the right, many of you might recognize a very young Happy Chandler. Happy Chandler was LaFoon's lieutenant governor. I tend to be very, I think, generous. A lot of historians are critical of the LaFoon administration. There's good reasons to be. LaFoon inherited a state with tremendous financial problems. It was, 1931, Great Depression. There was not enough money coming into the state coffers to fund existing state programs. And on top of that, LaFoon had to deal with New Deal programs coming down from Washington and having to fund the state or find money to fund the state's share for those programs. He tried, he initiated or recommended to the legislature passage of a state sales tax. He was defeated in large part to the work of Happy Chandler, who by this time was the two figures were alienated from each other. But Happy Chandler and many of the special interests in the state bitterly opposed LaFoon in his efforts. But before he ended office, LaFoon did manage to push through his sales tax and seemed to be on top in terms of being in control of state politics. And everything depended upon who followed, because the sales tax that was passed was good for only a year. So he needed somebody to follow him who would continue on and extend the sales tax. Well, his choice was for governor to replace him was Thomas Ray from Russellville in Logan County, another Western Kentuckian. Tom Ray, LaFoon felt like if the choice of the Democratic candidate could be thrown to a convention, primaries had not yet become the habitual way of electing Democratic nominees. But so LaFoon favored a convention which he could control, but he made a mistake. He decided to cross the state line and by train and go to Washington, D.C. to confer with federal authorities about matters pressing the state. And Chandler had been clued in, and as soon as LaFoon left, Chandler, as acting governor, called a special session of the legislature for the purpose of approving a state primary. It was contested in the court. The courts ruled in Chandler's favor. The legislature passed the primary, actually a primary with a runoff. And so Happy Chandler and Tom Ray, faced each other, and with several other candidates, but it was essentially it was Chandler and Ray. Ray actually won the first primary, and in the runoff, all the other minor candidates threw their support to Chandler, and Chandler goes on, uses the sales tax as his cudgel as his main platform, removal of the sales tax, and wins election in 1935. But I think, one thing to keep in mind, you see here in this slide, basically the next 40 years of Kentucky Democratic politics that was marked by factionalism. And the two factions are represented essentially here. You've had a Chandler faction, and then you had what could easily be called the anti-Chandler faction, LaFoon, and there would be others down the road who would be opposed to Chandler. But these two factions fought each other for control of the state, and during this period, basically the Democratic primary was, for the most part, the election. Okay, so Chandler was governor for 1935 through 38. He, like I said, he repealed the state sales tax, but he had to put something in its place, and he is the author of the income tax, the state income tax. And if we go on to the next slide, actually, before we get there, I don't have a picture of Keene Johnson. Keene Johnson was Happy Chandler's lieutenant governor. He was born in Lyon County. His father was a minister, and the Johnsons moved around quite a bit during his youth. After once he grew up, he went east to get into the newspaper business as a publisher in Moorhead, got into politics. He actually ran on Tom Ray's platform, but he was elected lieutenant governor. He and Chandler got along very well, and Chandler supported Keene Johnson. Once Chandler decides to move into the Senate, he steps down before the end of his term and allows Keene Johnson to move in, and Johnson appoints Chandler as a U.S. Senator. Here is a picture of two very important Western Kentuckians. In the center is Earl Clements from Morganfield in Union County. He was governor in 1947. He went on to the U.S. Senate and was the whip to LBJ, to Lyndon Johnson, and was on track to become majority leader in the Senate had he not lost his 1956 re-election campaign. The fellow to the right is also from Western Kentucky. This is Henry Ward, a journalist who was on the staff of the Paducah Sun Democrat, elected to the State House at the early age of 21 during the LaFoon administration. He's a very important figure in state politics. I'm not sure what year this picture was taken, but Clements appointed Henry Ward as his conservation commissioner, and Henry Ward went on to become essentially the father of Kentucky's state park system. He later, during the administrations of Burt Combs and Ned Breathitt, was highway commissioner and was a major figure in laying out the state's interstate system as well as its parkway system. He went from there and ran for governor in 1967, but lost to Louis Nunn. So very close election. He came close, but and he would have been, by the way, he would have been the first governor from the Jackson Purchase. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later, perhaps. Next slide. Okay. The next governor from Western Kentucky that I need to talk about is on the right, seated at the right. That's Ned Breathitt from Hopkinsville. He was elected in 1963. I want to spend just a moment on the lady seated well, the only woman in the room, and that's Kathleen Peden. I hate to, I'm embarrassed that I had so few women to talk about, but Kathleen Peden was a very important. She was Ned Breathitt's economic development chief of staff, and did remarkable things in terms of industrial recruitment. She was the only woman on the Kerner Commission that LBJ put together to study civil unrest in the nation's cities. And she ran for US Senator in 1968, ran a very tough race, lost by a small margin, but that ended her political career in 1968. So next slide. This is Wendell Ford from Davis County, elected governor in 1971 and served to 1974. I think he's working the phones during an emergency caused by tornadoes during his administration. Of course, Ford went on. He resigned early, like several other governors have, resigned early to take a open seat in the US Senate. And of course, went on to have a long career in the US Senate. Okay, Scott. This is a campaign brochure, and on the left again is Wendell Ford. On the right is Julian Carroll. Julian Carroll is the only governor from the Jackson Purchase. The Jackson Purchase was the strongest Republican area, Democratic area in the state, and it was a very sore spot for people in the Jackson Purchase, that despite their long history of supporting Democrats, they had failed to actually see one of their own elected governor. So finally, in 1974, when Ford steps down, Julian Carroll becomes the first governor from the Jackson Purchase, and he went on to win in 1975 a full term on his own. Okay. If you'll give the screen back to me, Scott, there were several other, I guess, you know, as an author, I'd say you're blessed to have such a wonderful cast of characters to write about. There were others that I feel like I should mention. I've already talked about Henry Ford, who with a few different breaks might have been elected governor. Also, Harry Lee Waterfield. Harry Lee Waterfield was from Hickman County. I remember very well my grandfather talking about Harry Lee Waterfield as a young boy. And Harry Lee Waterfield, many people are surprised. I've had a number of people comment that they did realize that Waterfield started out in the anti-Chandler faction. Well, he did. He was in the state legislature for a number of years, and Happy Chandler, there was no love lost between Chandler and Waterfield's father-in-law, who was agriculture commissioner during Chandler's first administration, and the first time that Harry Lee Waterfield campaigned for the state house. Happy Chandler made a point of saying some not so kind things about Waterfield. But Waterfield went on to, within the anti-Chandler faction, he was Speaker of the House for 2 terms. He ran a close race, lost to Earl Clements for governor in 1947. And in 1955, he makes the transition into the Chandler faction. Chandler thought his chances for re-election for a 2nd term would be boosted by getting Waterfield on the ticket. And I think the understanding was that Waterfield would run with Chandler, and then Chandler would in 1959 support Waterfield for governor. Waterfield does run against Burt Combs in 1959, and probably could have beaten Combs had the election been more about Waterfield than and less about Chandler. But in any case, he lost. He did go on to a 2nd term as lieutenant governor during the Breathitt administration. And I've already mentioned Henry Ward. I want to say something, one other governor or one other opportunity for Western Kentuckian to become governor took place in 1995, and it's just a little bit outside of my area, my time frame. But in 1995, Larry Forgy, who's not a Democrat, he's a Republican. He's from Logan County, and he ran a very, very close race against Governor Patton. And anyway, it would have been interesting. I've often thought a good trivia contest or trivia question for a Kentucky trivia game would be, who's the only Western Kentucky Republican ever elected governor? And that would have been William S. Taylor. Those of you who may know your Kentucky history might remember that Taylor was elected in 1899 in the controversial election that ended up with the assassination of William Goebel. Taylor only served 50 days. The legislature disagreed with the election results, decided that they were going to put William Goebel in as governor. But before that happens, an assassin mortally wounds Goebel. They swear him in. He dies. But in the meantime, Taylor, escaped, fled the state to Indiana to avoid being caught up in the criminal proceeds that took place after the assassination. There were a number of other people that I can't go into all of them, but I really was blessed to have had the opportunity to meet other figures from Western Kentucky that are important. For example, Jody Richards from Bowling Green, a longtime Speaker of the House. Don Blandford from Owensboro, another Western Kentucky speaker. Again, a long time. These are 2 examples of strong speakers. 2 fine examples of what legislative independence meant in the state. Every Monday morning for the past probably 10 years, I have had breakfast at McDonald's with Billy Ray Paxton, a good friend of mine who was House Speaker pro tem during the Ford administration, as well as for a short time the Highway Commissioner. Richard Freimeyer, interviewed him several times, from Madisonville, who was a Senate Majority Leader during the Ford administration. And I have to really compliment Kentucky Kentucky has done an excellent job in collecting oral histories. Many of the people that I deal with in my book had died years ago, but I was able to, to recapture a great deal of information from the oral histories that were on file, either at the University of Kentucky or Murray State. But let me go on. I know we're getting a little short on time. The outside reader I mentioned earlier had recommended that I look closer at what was going on in Western Kentucky at the local level, and I was really struck by the level of grassroots civic engagement that I found in Western Kentucky. Just a couple examples, quick examples. There was the Lower Tennessee Valley Association that in the 1930s, with the coming of TVA, worked to try to get a dam on the Lower Tennessee River to improve, to deal with the terrible problems that Western Kentucky faced in terms of flood control, and also to provide a year-round navigational channel for the Tennessee River, improve recreation opportunities, and to provide cheap, affordable electricity. That was a real problem for Western Kentucky, and much of my book is spent on the fights that went on between public and private power during the period that I cover. And so this Lower Tennessee Valley Association did very important work in terms of convincing TVA to build a high dam versus a series of low dams that would meet the goals in terms of recreation and electricity and navigation. They also worked very hard in Washington to secure funding for what's now Kentucky Dam, and at a time when the private power, coal interests, and railroads were not in support of funding Kentucky Dam. One of the big issues that played out during the Keene Johnson's administration was allowing cities in Western Kentucky to benefit from the electricity that Kentucky Dam would bring when it went online in 1944. A change in law was necessary, and to that end, a Kentucky Public Power League was formed, led by a number of mayors from cities that wanted to get on TVA, and they worked very, very hard, and in a crucial vote turned Keene Johnson, who had not been willing to sign a bill in 1940, excuse me, but in 1942 stood up to Kentucky Utilities and the other its aligned other special interests, and signed the bill that allowed for Western Kentucky cities to access that affordable electricity. That was a huge development. In the early 1950s, just to give you an example, when the country we were in the Cold War, we were in a shooting war, hot war, the Korean War. And anyway, the federal authorities were looking for a place to locate a second uranium enrichment plant. Well, the decision comes down, and Paducah is selected. Without that affordable, plentiful electricity, Paducah does not get that uranium enrichment plant. Now, we can, based on what happened years later, may wonder whether that was such a good deal or not. But in any case, the enrichment plant was a huge development for Paducah, and it also had a very important role in increasing the amount of coal produced in the Western Kentucky coal field, where I'm currently living. There was formed a Green River Valley Citizens League, which hoped to get federal funding to make improvements on the Green River so that the large coal barges on the Green River could deliver coal to the power plants for the energy that was going to be needed by the uranium enrichment plant. To give you an idea of what this meant, in 1946, there was only 350,000 tons of coal shipped on the Green River. By 1959, that had increased to 9 million tons. So you see a huge increase. And of course, a lot of that was made possible by strip mining that became so popular in Western Kentucky. So there for about 20 or 30 years, Muhlenberg County was either top or near the top in terms of counties nationwide in terms of coal production. I do need to say a few words. Most people want to know from me or ask me about, so what happens to the Democratic Rock of Gibraltar? What's the explanation? And a lot of people will suggest, well, it had to do something, had to be something connected to civil rights. I don't find that very persuasive. The Brown decision comes down in 1954. Civil rights legislations passed in Kentucky in the mid-1960s. Western Kentucky remained Democrat until 1994. And 1994 is the year that both the first congressional district and the second congressional district went Republican. So I see the explanation more in terms of the social issues that came to dominate not only Kentucky politics, but national politics. And by this, I mean talking about the Equal Rights Amendment. Western Kentucky was the Equal Rights Amendment was vigorously debated in Western Kentucky. Kentucky went very early in terms of ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment in 1972. But that soon created a backlash that had real strength in Mayfield and in Owensboro. And it was expressed in a movement to rescind the vote on ERA. There were a total of 5 states that eventually rescinded their votes on ERA, and Kentucky was one of them. It took a number of years for that to happen, but Western Kentucky and the churches in Western Kentucky were very active participants in that movement. Many of those people that were involved in the rescission effort went on to be activists in abortion. Abortion moved on to other matters such as Second Amendment, to gay rights and other matters. So that by 1994, and there were other important factors. I think one of the factors in what happened in Western Kentucky had to come with the 1990s redrawing of the congressional map. Instead of as Western Kentucky lost population, instead of moving Owensboro out of the second district into the first district, Owensboro decided, really wanted to stay in the second district, and with Congressman William Natcher, hoping to get a bridge over the Ohio River. Well, they got their bridge, but Natcher, who by this time was an old man, died in 1994. And that created an opportunity for Mitch McConnell to do some behind the scenes work in terms of making it possible for the Republicans to, in the special election, to replace Natcher. You see a Republican take that position. He replicated that in the first district. Didn't think it was going to happen, but 1994 was a bad year for Democrats, if you think about it. And one of the things that worked in Western Kentucky was that the election became nationalized. Tobacco farmers were mad at Bill Clinton, who, by the way, many people might recall, or I know a number of people from Western Kentucky remember Bill Clinton coming to Paducah on election eve in 1992. On election eve, he stops in Paducah and has a rally and uses that to help not only in Western Kentucky, but also Illinois, Indiana, Missouri, and Arkansas. But in any case, by 1994, tobacco farmers are mad because the Clinton administration, was strongly considering using increased taxes from tobacco products to fund its healthcare program, and also, going on was Newt Gingrich's, contract on America. In any case, long story is that Western Kentucky in 1994 and forever after that becomes Republican. There have been a few breakthroughs, but as we speak today, there is only one Democrat in the General Assembly from Western Kentucky, and that's Patty Minner from Bowling Green. No others. With that, Patrick, I'll turn things back over to you for questions and answers.
Well, thank you so much, George, for that presentation. I would point out to all of our viewers that we do have a promo code in the chat where the University Press of Kentucky has provided 30% off and free media mail shipping for the book. If you use the code there in the chat, that's good through the end of May. So please get that in there. And while you're there, please put in your questions that you want to ask George. I was really wondering, and we have one question in here already. We've just come to the end of the Gibraltar. What about the beginning? What about Western Kentucky makes it a Democratic stronghold? Let's feel free to range back in time a good deal.
A lot of that has to do with the Civil War, I think. From the very beginning, or since the Civil War, both the first and second congressional district were consistently Democratic, and the Republicans are associated with the abolition of slavery, and a lot of Western Kentuckians. Now, if you recall, I think you had Barry Craig on one of your programs several years ago, and he talks about certainly Civil War in the Jackson Purchase, and the idea of Kentucky becoming joining a lost cause after the cause is already lost. In the case of at least the Jackson Purchase, the Jackson Purchase was Confederate from the start. But I think the legacy of the Civil War certainly had a lot to do with Western Kentucky being Democratic all those years.
It really does cement that identity, certainly. And then, I as the Trigg County in here, there's a lot of those families that don't have the same migration patterns, even into the early Kentucky. They're coming in on Carolina land and 1812 land grants, and they're coming from South Carolina, and it's an entirely different population than we see coming down, Ohio or over the mountains in those first couple decades of settlement. There's some deep causes back in there. It's often been said that Kentucky's politics are the damnedest, and you've had some opinions on that line. You think that's fair in relationship to Western Kentucky?
Well, I think they're colorful, and I'll mention to you, and I've enjoyed always talking about this. I remember Al Smith very early on when I interviewed him, educated me on the nature of Kentucky politics and focused on the 1958 first congressional race. And Al Smith at that time was a new newspaper editor in Russellville, and he got his education in Kentucky politics from Emerson Doc Beecham. Doc Beecham is one of these, what was frequently called kingmakers, and a very strong anti-Chandler man. In any case, Beecham was very, very angry at Chandler for redrawing congressional districts and putting Logan County in the first district. So in the 58 race, you had a long-time incumbent who was running for re-election, and then a young Frank Stubblefield. And anyway, Al Smith told me the story that basically that Doc Beecham had taken control of the election machinery in Logan County, and the election night, the Paducah paper calls Al Smith and wants the returns from Logan County, and he can't provide them. Well, it turns out, long story, that Beecham had held up until he heard the returns from all the other counties, and miraculously, in a landslide vote, he secured enough votes in Logan County that put the challenger over the edge, over the line, and Noble Gregory was defeated. That was a stolen election. Oh, so in any case.
Well, and I was thinking a lot, about when you were just talking there about, what is it that leads to this nationalization of politics? You sort of point, in the 80s and the 90s, really, to that being the thing that kind of tips the balance. And what are the on the ground factors there? Is that because of increased, TV coverage, and you can get national news, and everybody gets, you're not filtered through your local paper like it used to be? Are there any, is there anything in the way of civil service reform within the state that allows those political machines to start getting eroded? What's happening then?
Well, and all of those things, all of the above, and and I think the Republicans saw very early on that they could steal the tactics, that the grassroots tactics that the Democrats had used, like I talked about, and turn it to their advantage. And of course, I think that in the case of Western Kentucky and much of the South, it was always conservative, and the Democrats moved increasingly to the left, and so by certainly by the year 2000, you hear people saying, well, I didn't leave the Democratic Party left me, and you can't be a Democrat and a Christian. These things become something that people just automatically say. But
yeah, no, I think that, I certainly heard that quite a bit back in Drake County, but yeah, it makes a lot of sense too. And on one level, you could see the collapse of that Democratic stronghold as a failure of the Democratic Party machine, but in some ways, you could see it's holding on in the face of that national shift between what the two parties are standing for and the drifting apart, the polarization that happens after the 60s. The fact that it doesn't crack till 94 maybe is an indication of the strength of that party machine.
Well, and keep in mind that even in Steve Beshear's two elections, now I think a lot had to do with having weak Republican opponents, but Steve Beshear essentially carried the entire Western Kentucky. I think he lost. I think his first election he lost only Butler County. So, and Andy Beshear, while he didn't carry Western Kentucky, did pretty well. I mean, he kept it close enough that in the big cities that he was able to again win against a fairly unpopular candidate.
Well, I'm thinking too, one of the big stories here throughout the time that your book covers in 20th century politics is this story of urbanization, right? And folks moving away from rural counties. We talked about how rural Western Kentucky has been and continues to be. Going forward, do you think that that we will ever see these sort of distinct regionalisms in state politics in Kentucky or anywhere? Are we really sort of moving towards some urban rural dynamics that are going to become more prevalent?
I think that's probably likely. Yeah. One of William Ellis mentioned something, and he never did really follow up, and I've asked him about it. He talks about a problem crescent in Kentucky, as opposed to the Golden Triangle. You have a problem crescent, which takes in basically Eastern Kentucky and all of Western Kentucky. And anyway, I've not thought what to do about it, but I thought that was an interesting sort of way of looking at things. And but boy, despite all the improvements, and I think that if you look at, I feel that there's been tremendous progress made in Western Kentucky, but you still have young people who just don't feel that there's enough in Western Kentucky to hold them, and and that's a problem.
Yep.
We're a much older, in comparison to many other, or a lot of areas of the state. We're an older, sicker community than perhaps say in the Golden Triangle.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that leads to a question that just came into the chat is, how do we get citizens re-engaged in politics? We see this lack of enthusiasm and participation, and machinery can be both a positive and a negative influence on that. Where do we stand in terms of re-engagement?
That's a good question. In fact, I've got a meeting right after this with a group of Democrats that are, we're going to be talking about how to get the message out. And I've been fairly active, over the years here that I've been here. It's a real struggle, but it's one, I guess you just have to keep at it.
Well, I know we're trying, at least at the Pilsen, to try and just connect back to civics education and get people sort of better instructed in the way that their voice can have an influence and use the past.
I don't know what happened to
inspire that. Yeah.
And history, even in colleges, it's just not, if you have to sacrifice for a lot of academic programs, to put more content in whatever technology you're in, career field you're in, you cut you cut history, you cut political science or whatever. I think it's a mistake.
Mm-hmm. Well, because very clearly we have all these questions that are yet unanswered about our state, and we need to know. We need those historians and social scientists to dig in.
Yeah.
We've got a really, really great question here about Catholic populations in Western Kentucky. And, you know, I thought back to that, you know, you're talking about those hot spots for that anti-ERA organization that really kicks off. How do Catholic Protestant dynamics play in Western Kentucky versus the rest of the state?
Well, I think most of the Catholic population's probably centered along the rivers, you know, certainly Owensboro, Paducah, Henderson, you know, but there are other pockets, obviously, like in Fancy Farm.
Fancy Farm, that's right.
I don't know if you hear Fancy Farm, don't realize that it's a fundraiser for the local Catholic Church in Graves County. So there are pockets. You know, I don't think that the old animosity between the Protestants and the Catholics exists, you know, anymore. On so many issues and social issues. You know, conservatives and the evangelical Protestant churches and the Catholic Church probably agree on a lot of those issues.
Yeah, and I think you're right. And this is just my anecdotal impression. You know, it seems like those especially those Catholic populations, saying around Owensboro and down in Mayfield, are that same sort of, you know, group of you know, English Catholics that come from Maryland, and you know, are not the immigrant Catholics that come in the 1840s and 50s, and then later that, you know, so much of that know nothing, you know, animosity is directed towards, and so sort of being otherwise economically and politically homogenous with their Protestant neighbors, it tend to fit in pretty well. There doesn't seem to be much, or certainly less, that kind of stuff. Well, I think we've run through all of our questions tonight, and we've covered a heck of a lot of ground. I'll again say, please use that coupon code that we put in the chat to go buy the book, Western Kentucky Democratic Politics Since the New Deal, The Fall of Kentucky's Rocks. George Humphreys, thank you so much.
Patrick, before we sign off, encourage you know, if you're going to use that code, make sure that you ask for media mail. The book's expensive enough, but if you have to pay $20 for shipping, you know,
a wise reminder in our
understanding is that the University Press is providing free shipping using media mail. So
absolutely, great reminder. Well, everybody go and pick it up, and thank you so much. This has been a really enjoyable talk.
Well, thank you.
All right, everybody have a good night.